I knew coming out of college that I wanted to be involved with some kind of cause, as many young people do. And I started working at a pretty small family support center in Los Angeles.
That is Melissa Hansen, co-founder and principal architect for the HiFi Consulting Group. I'm Josh Burke, your host for the Salesforce Developer Podcast, and here on the podcast, you'll hear stories and insights from developers for developers. Today, we sit down and talk with Melissa about her experiences with the HiFi Consulting Group and their work with nonprofits, and we take a particular sample of them building out an application using Experience Cloud. For now, we kick back where we started from that quote and talk about her early years and getting into Salesforce.
Yeah, it was an amazing organization. It's still around. It's called Friends of the Family.
Mm-hmm.
And they provided like sliding scale counseling, parent education, classes for young parents, all kinds of really great programming. And, you know, as many small community organizations, especially back then, they didn't have a lot of technical wherewithal or tools. And they didn't have a database of any kind. There were paper files. I can remember the huge filing cabinets in our executive director's office. Literal files.
Yeah.
And but what we did have is we had Microsoft Office, which comes with Access.
Right.
And so I took a class at there's I forget what it's called, but there's a nonprofit specific tech center, or there was in LA. And so I took like a week-long class in Access and I built us a donor database.
Really?
Yes. I do believe they've moved on from it, but they used it for many years. And through that process, it's one of those things where after that class, like that was immediately the favorite part of my job. Like I had, I did a million things there, events and all kinds of stuff, but all I really wanted to do was work on that database. And so I figured I might want to lean into that.
So I think I'm already hearing where this is probably going, because the slippery slope of the pain of spreadsheets and paper and all of this stuff into databases then often leads into my next question. How did you get in the Salesforce ecosystem?
Yes. After that organization, I worked a couple places with, existing databases like Razor's Edge. And then I took a job at an organization called Stand for Children, where I am now in Portland, Oregon. And they were in the process of transitioning from Razor's Edge into Salesforce. And so I was hired to help the implementation and all of the database transformation work. And that's how I kind of got my foot in the door with using Salesforce.
Got it. And I kind of feel like maybe this is a little bit of, maybe you just said all the things, but describe a little bit about HiFi Consulting and what you do.
Yeah, so HiFi Consulting Group, co-founded with my partner, Rich Nevin, just over a year ago. And we work with nonprofits who are on platform already. Generally, we don't do implementations, but organizations who are using Salesforce and are ready to kind of take the next step. Maybe they have a program they want to scale bigger, or they need like a custom interface, or they have some processes that are just killing them productivity-wise and aren't quite working. And we really specialize in building custom apps on platform, within the Salesforce ecosystem to help them do what they need to do.
Gotcha. Now, I heard a lot about databases, Razor's Edge transitioning to on-platform. I've heard that story in the past as well. But I'm missing a little bit of how are you going from admin to on-platform ramping to, today we're going to talk about like performant Lightning Web Components and some very specific developer stuff. What was your journey from admin to developer?
Yes. So after we implemented Salesforce, we immediately started, doing some custom code work. So I was lucky to be in a group that included a lead developer, a front-end developer, and a CTO. And so we were a pretty tech-forward organization and a pretty ambitious organization in terms of what they wanted to be able to build for their in-house purposes and also public-facing. And the short of it was I had great mentors. So there were a couple of guys who were just like, "Hey, Melissa, like you should start picking up the coding side." And I had thought about it previously, but it can be hard to figure out where to plug in to kind of get started.
Yeah.
And they started feeding me, test classes to write and, little trigger handlers.
Oh, okay. So I have to call that out. So they had you starting with their test classes, did they?
Yeah, I think there was a plan. Looking back, I can see a few reasons for giving me
That particular
test
test.
coverage. I know it's a little silly, but I think it's not a bad place to put someone if you want to familiarize them with what the code is doing in a current org.
Yes, and I was going to say, I mean, I think there's a joke in there that obviously, devious developers not wanting to have to do their own unit tests, but you do have to be very orthogonal to what's happening in that org, and I'm assuming you probably learned a lot about the functional code that was already in there because you're trying to poke at all the corners and the crevices to see what it's actually doing.
Yes, exactly. It brings the right questions to the fore pretty quickly because you get in there and you have to understand what it's supposed to be doing, how it's supposed to be doing it, how you might break it. And so it was a really good way to learn. I didn't exclusively, I think the plan was for me to just work on tests for a while, but it's a pretty nimble organization. So very quickly, as soon as I was useful in that regard, I started, building what needed to be built and getting a lot of support along the way, which I think that's one of the more crucial pieces, because it's a lot of work to pick up a whole new skill set mid-career. And, I did a lot of self-study. This is actually right when MOOCs were taking off, the massive online enrollment courses. I think edX is a big one. That's the one that I use. There's Coursera. And so I took the first CS 101 virtual class, which was the Harvard class.
Right.
So I'm an overachiever, I guess. So it was like C+. And
oh, wow.
It was super hard.
Oh, wow.
I learned a ton. But I had my phone of friends at work, which was clutch.
So specifically, what was the first programming language you really sucked your teeth on? Was it C++ or was it Apex?
I was...
Or a little bit of both?
Good question. I think it was a little bit of both because I was figuring out what the Apex did functionally and just, you recognize patterns and you figure it out. But alongside, I was getting the fundamentals of programming on the C+ side.
Right. That is so fascinating because it's like, I honestly expected you to say JavaScript. Because like that's so easy to be like the gateway drug of coding, but you went strongly typed and then loosely typed. So were you one of those people when you first started talking to JavaScript, it actually really aggravated you?
Yes. Yes. It's funny because I do see that a lot of people coming from, maybe web stuff and CSS and HTML, then they pick up JavaScript. And I am the opposite because I really like databases and back-end structures. And the front end is still kind of a challenge for me. Like I've gotten, friendly with JavaScript, but CSS continues to not be my best friend.
Right?
So fiddly.
All of us JavaScript developers we're right there with you. Like a very contentious relationship with CSS, and as much as I adore JavaScript, sometimes I've had arguments with it too. It happens. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the application that we're going to kind of go over. You presented at Cactus Force, and you gave a breakdown of this application, but. So let's dissect it and get into the process of building it. But first, let's start with the audience. Who were the users that you were architecting for?
So this was for Stand for Children again, and the audience were their community organizers. Okay. So these are staff. They are generally, this is like a 1 to 2 year role. Some superstars, can go a lot longer, but a lot of recent college grads or recent AmeriCorps folks, and they are going out into communities and working with, in this case, parents on getting familiar with the public school system, advocating for their kids. They do a lot of legislative work, so it could be getting out the vote or calling people and making sure that they're talking to their school board. It's almost like sales in that you are, working leads and trying to cultivate leaders, and you're not trying to get them to buy anything. You're trying to get them to participate.
Gotcha.
So it's a lot of like on the ground footwork kind of
Got it. Got it. I think it is interesting how much I think people who haven't gone too much into the nonprofit world realize the parallels that exist when it comes to the sales cycle. Because like you were mentioning Razor's Edge, we have NPSP, and there's so much of it, which is points of contact, leads, accounts, opportunities, like all the things that you see in the business world. Sometimes you're chasing down a donation and sometimes you're chasing down an ally, right?
Yes. And it's interesting because there are those similarities structurally and process wise, but the guts are so very different. One of the fun things on the nonprofit side is that, and I'm biased. I'm sure this exists on the for-profit side as well, but they're doing such interesting and specific things. And so translating that is important because if you're using the language of leads and opportunities, that's not gonna hit well.
Gotcha. So even though the roles are the same, the nouns are actually really important.
Exactly. So these community organizers, the thought process when we're looking at this group and thinking about them as our customers is they need an application that is going to make sense for them that looks like their job. So the goal is to have them, open up the program, take a look around, and without a lot of training or handholding, they can kind of go, oh, okay, I get this. This makes sense because these are the words that I use. These are the structures that I think in. I can go use this. Whereas just dropping them into Lightning Experience in Salesforce probably wouldn't be as successful.
Got it. Okay. What describe the size of the development team you were working with?
So for this application, it was my partner, Rich Nevin, and myself for HiFi. And then we were augmenting their staff, which was a Apex developer, a sort of junior front end. So a guy who's really great with CSS, mark up all the stuff that I hate.
You got to have that one. You got to get that one CSS whisper in order to not lose your mind.
Oh, absolutely. And then like a project manager and director level person over there as support. So that was the team size essentially. Okay. Two sort of Apex backend developers / Lightning Web Component developers and a CSS whisperer. And I should say Rich Devin's role is really on the product side. So he comes from that background. That's the way that he thinks. And so he's responsible for, not just translating, the business requirements and getting the user stories, but also the design of the thing, how it's going to look and interact.
Okay. So he's kind of product, but also sort of your UX / information architect.
Yes, many hats that we all wear.
Many hats. And, I can really, from an architectural point of view, it's so important, right? To have that as a first foot forward before you actually start coding anything, right?
Yes. And, this is, I don't know, maybe I'm jumping ahead here, but as the Lightning framework has matured, the tools and supports around it have just gotten better and better. So for this app, we use Sketch.
Got it. And so we can give that an extra shout out. I think, did you use the Lightning Sketch plugin? I think those are all the right nouns.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Which is such a cool way to build, wireframes or a prototype using the framework that we're going to be building with. And it's almost like giving him, because blank page design is hard, right? Yes. If you're just trying to design out of the clear blue sky, you really are going to need a UX specialist.
Yes.
But since we've already constrained ourselves in a positive way of saying, okay, we're using Lightning Web Components, we'll go custom when we need to, but in general, these are good designs, good patterns. Users are familiar with them. Let's use what we've got. So it's like, here's your, the Lightning Web Components or base components library. Like, this is your grocery store. You can pick anything off the shelf. If we need to do a custom order, we will. But it's a way to make sure that he doesn't come with a wireframe that we look at and go, well, that's going to take 6 months to get half done.
Right. Well, Yeah, well, I was just because back in my days of a consultant and actually being an enterprise developer, we would start with wireframes and all this kind of stuff. But I just have this phrase burned into my mind because it was on every single one, which was wireframes are not design, right? Like wireframes were the inventory of things that we were going to have to build, but they were absolutely no way an obligation that pixel was going to, that this was going to be exactly in that corner or these pixel widths or stuff like that. Like that would come later. And it's just kind of cool for me to hear that we've reached to a point where that may still be a little true, but it sounds like the wave has collapsed to a certain extent.
I think so, because the first sort of standalone Lightning app that we built on Salesforce, we did go to the comps level. Like he made design comps.
Gotcha.
And it was a lot more custom styling. And that was with Aura. So it was a little while ago. But the maturity of the component library and the styling has made it so that we kind of, it's not that it would hurt, especially if you were trying to do something that had, a really specific look and feel that was different, but that's not what we were going for.
Right. Okay, let's pull back the calendar a little bit because you just mentioned Aura, and then I believe there was an iteration of not an iteration of your application, but there was an original app that you were replacing. What was that like?
Yes. So it's called the Organizer app, since it's for organizers.
Okay.
And the first version of this, when this have been maybe 8 years ago, 8 or 9 years ago. And it was a Apex REST API backend. So all of the backend was in Salesforce, but then an HTML5 front end. And at that time they had a full front end web developer on staff. So that was, and we used a consulting group. That's right. We also sorry, a while ago, there was a consulting group that we worked with who did a lot of the initial build of that app and then kind of handed it over. And, it was great. That app really changed the organization in a lot of ways because it saw what you could do when you really build the right tool. And so I think it gave the organization even more of an appetite to say, oh, we can do this. We can build really cool things that are specific to what we're trying to do instead of trying to cobble together things that don't quite work.
Right. Well, and maybe this is going too far into the calendar date, but out of curiosity, do you remember what that app, the REST-based HTML5 one, like what process was that replacing?
Oh, yes. That was replacing a lot of paper. It was replacing spreadsheets. It was, it was replacing a lot of arduous, hand-built tools. Yeah, there was no corollary in terms of an actual app. It was just the variety of tools that they had stitched together to get their jobs done. To get a process done. I'm trying to remember which interview it was, but I remember back in my model metrics days, my favorite clients were always the smaller the business, the more I loved working with them because these small scrappy shops, which most nonprofits are in some form, a small scrappy shop, you fix that process for them and convert it into an application, and it just means so much to them. You've saved so much of the day. Whereas an enterprise, a lot of the big enterprise people were kind of like, why are you in my boardroom? Like, why are you in this meeting room? I have my own developers kind of thing. And so I always loved working with the small shops because they were just so appreciative of the time that they had just saved. Yeah. And that actually gets to a value that we hold really deeply, which is the value of the work that a lot of nonprofits are doing is huge. And sometimes they're constrained because they have to be, and sometimes they're constrained out of habit to just use what's available and make it do. And when you invest in a tool that's the right tool that gets the job done, that's probably going to save money in the long run, I feel like it puts a lot of value on the work that they're doing, right? Yeah. You're saying to the community organizer, this job matters. What you're doing is important, and we built a tool to do it the right way.
Right. Now, this is probably a little bit of a self-evident question, but pulling that back towards the future, what are some of the gains that you get when you replace like an HTML5 REST application, which is with something that's pretty much purely on the platform?
I mean, for one thing, we were able to do it without having to hire a front-end developer, which is not to say, front-end developers are great, and sometimes you need them. I am not trying to replace that role. I should hasten to mention.
Sure.
But in terms of being able to use the skill sets that are in-house or that you already have with, a consulting relationship, the maintainability issue is huge.
Gotcha.
Right? Because if you have to have all of these stacks that you're maintaining, you've got your AWS servers that you have to keep track of. Maybe you've got Drupal on the website that you have to keep upgraded. There's a new release of PHP, which is going to break the front end. There's a lot of different skill sets. And if you have a team that's really familiar with Salesforce and has those Salesforce skills, even if it's something they need help building, they're going to be able to maintain it so much more easily because it's all on platform and those skills transfer.
Yeah.
So I think that's a huge gain, just keeping that footprint smaller and focused on what's the value of this thing versus trying to have, a full-blown tech team for an organization that maybe wouldn't need it otherwise.
Gotcha. And I acknowledge, especially since I'll ask after the Aura version first. But since we're talking today about kind of performance and some tips to creating these experiences in Experience Cloud, how did the performance of the Aura version compare to the original REST version?
That's a good question. It was definitely faster.
Okay.
It's also this is
good. That was the answer I was hoping for.
So different. It was so slow. We were definitely saving trips, right? We were saving trips, and we were able to load data in a way that made more sense. I mean, I should also say, along with the new application was a new data model, so it's a little bit oranges and orangutans to compare.
I like that one. I'm going to have to remember that one.
That actually is a line from one of my mentors back in the early days.
Nice. Oranges. Okay. I'm going to note that. So let's poke at that a little bit. I do want to talk about LWC and I want to talk about Experience Cloud, but an important part of getting to that performance shift you're saying is not just how you're building up the client, but what you're building the client up to. So what were some of the considerations? Let's start with the data model, then move to Apex.
Okay. Yeah. The data model is one of my favorite things to work on.
Nice.
So we use a pattern. So this organization, in addition to having, a couple of Lightning Web Component based apps that are hosted in Experience Cloud, they also have integrations with, their marketing and advocacy platform and a couple other tools. There are definitely users who are in the, the regular Lightning experience. So there's a lot of consumers of this data. And it was important to think about, not having the logic spread out in too many places. We don't want to have business rules in a flow and in a trigger handler and in a Lightning controller, because things get out of hand really quickly. And so we use the domain layer a lot and a lot of encapsulation classes.
Okay.
So if you think about, the data model at the bottom with our S objects, cool.
Yeah.
And then one layer up from that, we use a lot of these classes that represent a business idea, team is probably a good example. All the people that they're organizing, they put into teams to work together. And in the data layer, a team is an account. But in the business logic layer, we have an Apex class that's team that you can instantiate, and it's got the business rules in there. If you're creating a new one, if you're closing it, if you're adding people to it, all of the consumers, whether it's something from the API or if it's a Lightning Web Component or if it's a trigger, are going to go through that same logic path. And then we have assurance that, all the rules are in one place, first of all, well, mostly in one place, and that they're going to be consistently applied, which is, a big deal.
Got it. Okay, so I find that a little fascinating because I feel like it echoes what you were saying previously about talking about those nouns. So am I paraphrasing this correctly, that you are encapsulating the noun and some of the associated verbs that they would be needing in their process, and you're putting that into the Apex layer for everybody to have access to, whether it's a Lightning Web Component or mobile application, or maybe even another REST application, or virtually anything that has to access talking back to that data layer.
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
Is it? I think it's also called object relational mapping.
Got it.
That was a new vocabulary. Actually prepping for Cactus Force.
It is. I'm trying to remember the first time I'm like in a meeting and somebody's like, well, why don't we do like a data access layer? And like, you mean SOCL? Like the concept of overwrapping something on the data layer into Apex hadn't actually really occurred to me at that time. I was a little young in my career. But I think I'll ask a follow-up question. Is there also, because that's a very sophisticated and also allows you to do better maintainability, and it feels like that's also important for a project that you're going to have a nonprofit who I'm assuming at some point they kind of assume control and maintain and will be maintaining this themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Like in this case, we have, a sort of longer term retainer, so I can still pop in and help with either other projects or with maintenance. But this is definitely something they can own and operate with or without me just fine. And I think that's a really important point, and something I think about a lot when I'm working on a project is who's going to inherit this.
Mm-hmm.
Like I tend to be somewhat verbose in the way that I write code, and I use a lot of comments. I'm definitely not playing the game of like, could I get this in one line? This is explicitly not the goal, because a lot of times I can imagine the next person's going to be maybe fairly new to this. And I want it to be super clear what this is doing and why.
Yes. And I thank you for that, because I have never been the kind of developer who has, I don't get me wrong, I want to do things in as few lines of code as possible. I'm not going to have somebody go check out my logic puzzle to figure out why my if statement realizes itself. So as somebody who has given code and taken code from other people, I deeply appreciate that.
I can also think of it as a side effect of being a non-traditional developer. Like I don't have a CS degree. And so some of the fancier tricks, maybe I don't use them because I don't know them. They're fun to learn and I love picking up new stuff, but sometimes I'll learn a thing and go, cool, I'm not going to use it though, because no one else will know what this is.
Right. Exactly. So, and I don't want to we'll point people to your presentation because I think you go into some depth with this. And it's easier, obviously, to see code than to hear code. But do you have, when you're talking about that data access layer, and I think I just used the wrong term, but when you're talking about these data encapsulating Apex classes, since they're data bound, do you have any tips on making those performant?
Yeah, one of the patterns is I tend to have constructors. So when I'm instantiating one of those object classes, if it's one that has the tendency to get really big, like the biggest one is person, as you can imagine.
Shocking.
The person is going to have a lot of related info, and they're going to have, in many cases, this application is all about lists, like finding the people. Who am I going to talk to next? I want to find 10 people who I can get to show up and testify tomorrow. And so we're giving them ways to just kind of manage and filter through and get to the right grouping as quickly as possible. Okay. So a person is going to have, lists of actions they've taken in the past and interests and a whole bunch of metrics associated with them. And so what I'll usually do is give some kind of Boolean of like, do I need all the extras or do I just need the basic part? Because sometimes I just want to load the person or a list of people and we don't need 5 years of activity data attached to them. So I think thinking through of like, what are the, maybe top 2 or 3 cases of why would I be, grabbing this object or an array of this object? And do I really need all of it? Or can I be strategic about, I don't need everything.
All right, so let's level set about the artist formerly known as Community Cloud, now known as Experience Cloud. And yes, I'm still doing that mental, hurdle myself. But at one point, building on sites in this cloud was really a heavily specialized experience, kind of tailored to how that worked. But now you're using base components, you're building out custom components. What's it like, not to sound too redundant, but what's the experience in building sites in Experience Cloud right now?
Yeah, and it's interesting because we've typically been using Community / Experience Cloud almost as a container because we've been really focused on building these custom experiences with components. And so especially early on, we couldn't use any of the built out templates. We weren't trying to create a typical community per se, but it gave us a platform and the ability to build an app, at first out of Aura components and now out of Lightning Web components, and then serve them out publicly, more or less, whether we're reaching a public audience or just like a bigger group of employees. But it gave us a nice container. I will say it's definitely a place where we've had to be conscious about what's supported, because things aren't necessarily supported for the Experience Cloud at the same time they are more generally.
So by supported, you mean like specific components that you could use on the Lightning platform, but maybe not within Experience Cloud?
Exactly. It might be base components, or it might be some other part of the framework. For example, the Lightning messaging service, I think, is just now in beta for Experience Cloud, whereas it's been available in the standard Lightning experience for a little bit.
Got it. And tell me a little bit more about using base components versus custom components. Did you have kind of a rule or guiding rule to know what to put onto the page and when?
Yes, we have. We very much have a guiding methodology there, which is, don't build it if you don't have to.
Okay.
We're not trying to create something, out of whole cloth. And the reason we've been able to build pretty robust apps very quickly is because we start with that base component library. So the rule is, at first, try and find a base component that does what you need it to do, hopefully just out of the box. We can apply some custom styling, of course, and get it where we need to get it. If for some reason one of the base components just doesn't quite work, or we needed to do something extra, we'll then extend. So a good example of that is Lightning Data Table, which we use all over the place, and we don't necessarily want to build a completely custom version of.
Yeah.
Also, it didn't quite get us what we needed in terms of the look and feel. It's very narrow rows, hard to read. So we extended it both stylistically. Is that a word?
I'll allow.
Okay. So that it looked more friendly. There's like a big button on it instead of a checkbox. That kind of thing. And then also some inline editing that wasn't available in the way we needed it to be. So we'll kind of add on features we need. And then, the last resort, if there really isn't something that does what we need it to do, we'll build something, quote unquote, from scratch.
Gotcha.
But, from scratch also means we start with SLDS. We go to the Salesforce Lightning Design System, and generally there's a pattern or a series of patterns that we can bring in so that we have consistency in the user experience, the look and feel, but we can also have something that's completely custom.
Got it. Okay. Well, let's dig into a little bit of the working parts of those web components when you are coding your own custom functionality. When you're talking about those JavaScript controllers, can you tell me a little bit about the importance and some of the performance gains you're getting when you're using the await async? No, I think I have that backwards. Async await model.
Yes. And I'll talk about the performance, but also just the ease of use. So I'm still, I'm definitely not a JavaScript expert. I am learning as I go, like I do with all the things. And so initially getting into JavaScript, promises were really confusing. And callbacks and callback chains were really confusing. And I got in there and fought that fight, and I can get myself back there and understand what's happening, but it's hard to follow. So async await gets us a couple of different things. For one, it wraps up that promise syntax in a way that is much easier to read and understand and know what is happening when. It allows you to execute things in a way that feels more synchronous, a little bit closer to Apex. Like I know if I have an async await line, the next thing isn't going to happen until it's done, which is one of those things that sounds easy, but can be a bit of a struggle to make sure that you've got the timing right, getting the data and trying to do something with the data only once you have the data.
Right.
So that honestly was a big part of it. And then, yes, the performance gains. So one of the patterns that I talked about in my Cactus Force presentation was sort of bundling together these async functions.
Oh, okay.
So if you have one function, that's fine. You do your async, you call the function, it waits until it gets the data back, and then you proceed. But if you have, as we sometimes do, 2 or 3 functions, and we can't move on to the next step until we all have all 3 of those promises resolved. But I don't care what order they go in. They're not dependent on each other. You can bundle those together so that they're executing, side by side, essentially. And then when all 3 have resolved, that promise will come back, and then I've got all the data, and then we can move on to the next thing.
Okay, well, changing topics a little bit, I want to make sure that we talk about Rad Women. First of all, what is it? And specifically, what does RAD stand for?
RAD stands for Radical Apex Developers. So it's a really cool program. So we're an all volunteer-based organization. And what we do is we offer free coding classes for women and non-binary folks who are advanced admins on the platform who want to get into the programmatic side. So when we talked earlier about sort of my personal history, I'm a non-traditional developer. I don't have a CS degree background, but I had great mentors on the job, and that's just lucky, and that's not good enough. And that is often why, you look around and there's not as much diversity and representation as we would want to see amongst developers. So the RAD program is a way of bringing that mentorship to anyone who needs it. So we have classes are, 6 to 8 learners. They're pretty small. Each has 2 coaches, and they meet once a week for 10 weeks for an hour and a half and really get into the fundamentals of Apex and what programming is from scratch. I think a lot of developers forget how much, really where you have to start, especially for if you're a developer who's been coding forever. You probably don't remember not knowing what primitives mean or what strings are. You can skip over that when you're talking to a new developer, and it's really alienating. We want to make sure we are, giving the fundamentals to a group of really smart people who want to move into the programmatic side, and we can give them the tools and the vocabulary and the coaching that they need.
So I just love all of that. And I especially love, the acknowledgement that it's, that's access to not just material, but to people that can get important. By the time this airs, I will have been on the admin podcast, and I actually brought up this conversation with them because they were talking about this journey where it's like, if admins want to become developers, like what should they kind of know? And I've just now heard it so many times that it's like success is sometimes other people. That it's like having access to those people who can be trusted allies, partners, mentors, advisors is what gets people to, to that next step and starts getting into those developer skills.
Yes, absolutely. And you're right on with the people part. Coaches are the most important part of this program by far. So if you're interested in either side, definitely follow us on Twitter. That's where the most information comes out, and where we talk about when we're recruiting or opening up registration, and we're at Rad Women Code on Twitter. You can also go to radwomen.org, and we've got some sign up forms there. And if there's developers listening, particularly if you identify as a woman or non-binary or a person of color, we'd especially love to hear from you, because we want great coaches and great representation. So please hit us up.
And that's our show. We will be including a link to Melissa's presentation from Cactus Force in the show notes. Be sure to check that out, as well as links to the relevant Rad Women information. Now, before we go, I did ask after Melissa's favorite non-technical hobby, and it turns out it's not just cooking, but like a lot lot of cooking.
But I really like project cooking and kind of nerding out with big, multi-step recipes.
Like how many steps?
Oh, too many. A good multi-day project, like a mole where you're grinding all your spices, or a bolognese where there's, 4 kinds of meat and 6 hours of simmering. Just feeds my soul.
I want to thank Melissa for the great information and conversation. And of course, as always, I want to thank you for listening. If you want to learn more about this show, head on over to developer.salesforce.com/podcast, where you can hear old episodes, see the show notes, and have links to your favorite podcast service. Be sure to also catch me on Twitter at Josh Burke, and also on Twitch at Josh Burke. Thanks again, and I'll talk to you next week.